it's not just about, you know, quitting your job and working 4 hours a week to then spend the rest of your life sort of idling in front of the TV, right?
Exactly.
It's about designing a lifestyle that offers you the opportunity to do something that you enjoy, something that you really love.
I first learned about Melody Chia from our mutual friend, Lauren Pierce, who's been on the podcast many times. You've probably heard her. And I was immediately intrigued, not only by the fact that she's a bassist living in Australia, originally from China, but also she is doing all sorts of interesting things outside of the bass world. It has a really great perspective on music in general, but also how music is brought to people in terms of marketing, in terms of messaging. And you got to follow along with Melody if you haven't on her Instagram account. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting with Melody Chia. And in addition to being a bassist, she is an expert marketer, and the left field, but not really as you listen, she is becoming really cool shoemaker. So and again, you got to go to her Instagram account and look through. And I'm flipping through right now as I'm recording this, and I'm seeing all these cool shoes. How did she start doing this? Why? What motivated her? How does that relate to music? Yes, it does, and we're going to get into that in this conversation. This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings, which I am playing on my bass now, and Upton Bass String Instrument Company, inventive, creative company. Love them so much. So we'll hear more about them later, but let's dig into this conversation, which I had such a great time having with Melody Chia.
I've been playing bass for about 4 years. And I've just been taking lessons with people who play in the Melbourne Symphony. And I have no plans to go back or to go to music school. And the goal isn't to necessarily get an orchestra job. It's just to get good enough so I can freelance with them and so I can play bass, basically, with a good orchestra.
So 4 years, but did you play something before bass?
Yeah, violin very, very badly.
Okay. Me too. So why bass of all things?
We bought one on impulse. So it was sitting in the corner for about a year and a bit. And I liked playing orchestra, but violin was never really the instrument I felt super connected with. And since we had the bass, I thought, why not give it a crack? I'll just take some lessons and see what happens. And turns out I really, really enjoyed it. And here we are 4 years later. So I think sticking with it was a sign that it was something that I really wanted to do.
I'm sure. Was it? So I remember my first bass experience. I played violin for maybe I don't know, five or 6 years. And then my orchestra teacher gave me a bass, and I remember trying to push the strings down, and it was super hard to play. And it probably had they were probably 5 centimeters off the fingerboard or something like that, but do you remember what it was like? Was it totally weird coming to the bass from violin? Yeah,
because the bass that we bought was cheap, and so it was slightly unplayable. The action was really high, and I think it was we weren't quite sure what the size was because the sticker in the bass didn't quite match the strings that we ended up buying. Couldn't figure out if it was a 1/8 bass or a 1/4 bass, but it was a little bass, but it was still really difficult to play. Mm-hmm. I think it was a blessing when I left the bass, I left the M pit out and the bass sort of leaning against the sofa when I left for work that day. And it fell over during the day and the scroll snapped. And that kind of pushed me to go looking for a slightly better bass, which has been, I think, a massive blessing because I felt what it was like to play a proper bass after that.
Well, sorry for the bass tragedy, but yeah, it could have been a blessing in disguise, just a forced upgrade. The day-to-day at an ad agency, what? I don't even have any idea what a job like that would be like. What is it different every day, or do you have kind of a consistency to it?
Well, what we do is largely the same, but depending on the project, your day-to-day, like the actual tasks ends up being different. So I work in accounts. So just going back, an ad agency is structured so you've got account service who are the people who basically run the business end of things. We manage our clients, so we're the client-facing people who take their briefs, find out what they need, and then bring that back to the agency, and we're the ones who brief the creatives. So the creatives are the ones who actually come up with all of the ideas, make all the pictures look really pretty, write the ads, whatnot. And as an account service person, you're the project manager and the one that's telling everyone what they need to be doing, making sure that things are running on time and on budget. So your day-to-day is, a lot of phone calls to the client, making sure that they're getting what they need, talking to the creators and making sure that they're doing what your client needs and keeping everybody on task and on track. So it depends on where we're at in a project timeline, as to what we're doing on a daily basis. But each day is usually pretty manic because you're constantly following up people on, deadlines, and you're trying to have 10 billion conversations to get to one solution. And yeah, it's usually pretty manic.
Okay. It must be quite a contrast then to like sit down with the bass whenever you get a chance to do that and work on that. And my get, because at least for me, when I sit down, that's like the opposite of that kind of work. It's like this almost like meditative thing where it's like me and the instrument and alone, this sort of monastic kind of work.
Yeah, I think that's why I enjoyed the bass so much, is because it was, when you're getting pulled in 10 different directions at any given time during a day, when you get to actually sit down and do one thing and be really focused on that one thing, it's calming. And and also when you're playing the bass, you kind of have to just focus on playing the bass, and your mind, if it wanders, it's not effective practice. So for me, it is like meditation, because I have to focus on this one thing and I cannot be thinking about the 10 deadlines that are coming up and all the other things that I might not have done during the day, because, you get caught up having conversations as opposed to being at your desk and being able to actually do the work you're supposed to be doing. Mm-hmm. So the bass has functioned as an escape for me in a really, really good way.
And like, when does that escape occur for you? I know when I have had full-time jobs in the past, and I've had several years of my life where I just come home and I'm beat, and like the last thing I want to do is play bass. I mean, are you playing after a long day of work? Are you playing on the weekends, or how does that fit into your life right now?
At the moment, I'm playing more on the weekends because work has been quite exhausting. So it is quite difficult to be playing at the end of the day. Which is something that I'm looking to change, because I want to be playing more, and I need to just come home and find the energy to just sit down and even just play scales, not necessarily, do any intense. I tend to leave the intense practice for the weekends when I actually have the energy to do that. So like learning new excerpts or figuring out fingerings and things like that. I find it very difficult to do after a long day's work. Mm-hmm. But yeah, my practice routine has changed quite a lot over the last sort of year, because I have let work take over my life, which isn't great. Mm-hmm. But when I was practicing for the concerto, I'm super goal driven. And I think that's partly why I wanted to do that concerto so early on, because I knew it would push me to get better quickly, because I knew I had to. And when I was doing that, I was still working a full-time job, but somehow I found the energy to get up and practice for at least an hour in the morning. And then I'd come home and do 2-3 hours, and then I would practice, 4, 5, 6 hours on the weekend. So I always think back to that time when it's like, well, if I was able to do that then, I should still be able to do it now. Except that now I don't have as clear or as definitive a goal as I did back then.
Yeah. No, I'm the same way with bass. Like in terms of goals, like or probably anything. If I zoom out and think about it, like I think I'm at my best when I am working toward a goal, and if that goal isn't an externally, directed one, I can sometimes drift musically and otherwise. So I have a super wide question for you, but I think it'd be interesting because this is something I think about a lot, and just sort of setting the stage. You're somebody who just me from an outsider perspective, I look at and I think, wow, Melody is insanely creative, whether it's visually what you're doing or making shoes or just everything you've started to write on this new blog. And then you work in an ad agency and you're practicing the bass. And I've thought a lot about just creativity in general and how I am exercising my creativity and what projects I'm doing really require a lot of creativity and don't. And I just toss it out there. Can you just talk a bit about creativity and these various silos of your life, how that fits in? I hope that's not too vague. No,
it's actually something I think a lot about as well, because the funny thing is working at an advertising agency, you're either a creative or you're a suit. Mm-hmm. And I'm a suit, right? Okay. And everyone just, you compartmentalize yourself into those two groups. And I've never actually, until recently, thought of myself as a creative because I've always been a suit. And I was having conversations with a few of my friends who are creatives in the agency, and they're like, I don't, because we're talking about work, and they go, oh, I don't know how you do this because you're more creative than you are a suit. Mm-hmm. And I was like, wait, you think of me as a creative? That's kind of a compliment and weird to think about because that's never been the way that I saw myself. Yeah. Even though, yes, I do play the bass and started making shoes. It always felt very practical for me. When you're playing the bass, yes, you're interpreting things off a page, but I'm playing music that somebody else has written. I haven't actually, created that. And then with shoes, it was always, I'm just following the instructions on a page, and I am making the shoes, but it doesn't feel like, I'm designing or advertising agency perspective. I'm not the one who's writing the ad or coming up with the big idea and making it look really good. Mm-hmm. Creativity for me is something that I think I've always just kind of taken for granted.
Yeah. Interesting. And so only recent, so in your quote unquote suit role at the advertising agency, was there any, can you remember a specific moment when you started to think of yourself as a creative? Was that within the last couple of years? Was it just during those conversations at work, or was it outside of work?
Yeah, no, that's just been in the last month.
In the last month? Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been, well, since the Christmas break, it's I've gained a lot of perspective on my life and what I've been doing. I think it's just opened up my mind to a whole possibilities, really. And I think, when I look at it, a lot of things I do is considered creative. It's just weird that I've never thought of those things as being creative. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a weird sort of reframing of the mind for me, because you think that, you've gone through so many years thinking that you're one thing, but then actually realizing that everyone else sees you as something else. Mm-hmm. Is kind of odd. Oh, yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
It completely makes sense. And so what was it over the winter break that, because I noticed it looks like you started up your blog right about the same time. Was there a precipitating event? Was there something that happened at work and life, a culmination of things that just started to make you think that way?
Yeah, bubbling sort of under the surface over the last few years, my dissatisfaction with working in advertising. And the problem has really been that it's not that I hate the job, because I I actually still do love many aspects of it, like working through the creative process. I love project managing. I do actually enjoy working to deadlines, and I still do get a thrill from accomplishing those, milestones along the way. Mm-hmm. What I think pushed me to do this is I found shoemaking, and I realized that there could be a different way of life. I don't necessarily want to be working this job where I'm completely burnt out at the end of the year every year, because I've just worked so many hours and it's nonstop, and it's demand on part of, the business that you work on. And I just realized after reading many personal development books over the Christmas break that I need to start figuring out if there could be something better or something different that I could be doing with my life. And everything was kind of swirling around in my head, and I thought, I need a way to get it out. And I thought a blog would be a good way for me to start figuring some of this in the process of me doing that. If it helps somebody else, then that would be great too.
This episode is brought to you by the A440 Violin Shop. It's located just down the street from Wrigley Field in beautiful Chicago on the north side, just off the Brown Line. I have been going there my entire adult life, and they have been fantastic, both for repairs. I've had cracks repaired. I've had seams glued. I've had all sorts of students go to A440 to get instruments, to get bows. They're available with a smile, do wonderful work, and definitely check them out if you are in the Midwest. A440violinshop.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast. Upton Bass has this amazing new offering in the works. I am so pumped about this bass. Gary put up a video of this travel bass. It is a bass. It is a real bass, but it's in a suitcase, a Samsonite suitcase, a sort of suitcase that you can get at the mall. You got to check this out. Gary takes out of the suitcase these pieces, and in just a few minutes, it's unbelievable. He assembles and starts playing this beautiful acoustic sounding bass, just like what we want, for any sort of gig that we might be doing. This is going to revolutionize bass travel, folks. Check this out and much more at uptonbass.com. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what were some of those books? I've noticed that you mentioned the 4-Hour Workweek, which is something that's influenced a lot of people's thinking.
The 4-Hour Workweek was one of the ones that I've been reading. And also the other book that I'm currently in the middle of is The Happiness Project.
Mm-hmm. That's another wonderful book. I haven't read The Happiness Project, but I've heard great things about it. I have read the 4-Hour Workweek though, and I've learned a lot from it. And I think that's a tricky book, because a lot of people, the title can be kind of misleading. Because at least in my opinion, it's not really about working 4 hours. It's more about freeing yourself up to pursue things and reorienting your career to be more meaningful. I think the titles can sort of throw people off track a little bit. 4-Hour Workweek. What did you take away from that book?
Well, I think the title of that book is kind of misleading, because mm-hmm. It's not just about, quitting your job and working 4 hours a week to then spend the rest of your life sort of idling in front of the TV, right?
Exactly.
It's about designing a lifestyle that offers you the opportunity to do something that you enjoy, something that you really love, but not having to slog at a job that takes away from your energy to then pursue things that you enjoy, and to actually just live life, as opposed to just constantly working all the time and having nothing to talk about with your friends, apart from the fact that you're talking about how busy you are all the time. Mm-hmm. And I think that book just kind of helped me in my head reframe how I wanted to approach life, and all these misconceptions I used to have about needing to feel like I had to have a legitimate job, because that's what you grow up thinking that you have to do. You you finish high school, you go to university, you get a proper job, and that's life. And that's what it means to be successful. But I've got a job. Technically, from an external perspective, people would say that, oh, yeah, she is successful. But I've never felt successful. And all I ever feel is stress. And at the end of the year, it just feels like the year's gone by and I haven't accomplished as much as I thought that I was going to that year.
Mm-hmm.
So reading this book just helped me think about what success actually means and what a successful life looks like for me as opposed to what a successful life looks like for society.
Mm-hmm. I hear you. I've had that struggle for years and years, and with age and experience, at least for me, I've started to realize that I've spent way too much of my life worrying about what these other people think.
Yeah.
They really aren't thinking anything about me, and even if they were, it doesn't amount to a hill of beans. But that's a real struggle that I think so many of us have, me included, just identifying with that job and worrying about how we appear to others and fit into others. And it's just so fun to watch you with this shoemaking direction, which seems like you're incredibly passionate about and something that has a lot of creativity in it. What's it been like starting to make shoes?
It's been great, actually. It's weird how it started, because I had it in my head sort of over the last couple of years that, that I wanted to play bass instead of working in advertising. Mm-hmm. But I'm pretty realistic and, a little bit cynical in that sense as well, which I think has been good for me in terms of the types of risks that I take with, life and jobs and money and that sort of thing. So the shoemaking started because I felt that if I wanted to play bass, I needed some other source of income that would allow me to work on my own time and be something that I would also equally enjoy. So I decided to do a short course at RMIT. And it was 14 weeks, once a week, you go and learn how to make shoes. And I enjoyed that process. And I I have a slightly unhealthy shoe shopping obsession.
Okay.
So I thought that if I learned to make shoes, I would cut down on the number of shoes that I would actually buy. And, my husband was like, yeah, that's, you say that now, but is that actually going to be the case? But it actually has been the case.
Nice.
Because now that I understand the shoemaking process, I like knowing that I could make a pair of shoes that I want myself. And I get more satisfaction doing that than actually going out and buying a pair of shoes. Mm-hmm. So it's been a lovely discovery, because when I took that short course, I didn't know if it was something that would stick. And then I found this other guy who makes shoes and runs a little workshop it's just outside of Melbourne. So I spent a little bit of time with him over the Christmas break, learning it's a slightly different technique of shoemaking, where you, instead of gluing the tops of the shoes to the soles, you hand sew it, which is, how all the sort of high-end bespoke shoes are made. Mm. And loved that process, because it was nice to be making something with my hands. And I think the problem I've always had with my job is that there is no tangible product. Mm-hmm. As an outcome of my work. When we're project managing, yes, you deliver an entire campaign on time, on budget, and whatnot, but it's not like you can say, when you're looking at the final bit of creative, be it a print ad or a commercial or whatever it is, you can't for me, it was always difficult to say, oh, I created that, because I didn't. I influenced the process and influenced the creative to an extent, but it doesn't feel like something that I made. And I think what I really enjoy about the shoemaking is you end up with this tangible product at the end of the process, and it was a nice change.
Yeah, it's something I've talked about with luthiers about, and just the experience of making an instrument, and how that and I remember chatting with a luthier named Arnold Schnitzer, and I said, how satisfying it must be to make something with your hands. And he said, it absolutely is, but you're not just making it with your hands, you're making it with your brain, and you're making it with everything. And it's just like this physical extension of you and your thoughts coming through your hands. And I just really like that. I thought that was a poetic way to think of it.
It is. I mean, there's a lot of problem solving in the shoemaking at the moment, because I'm still figuring it all out. Like, I still don't know what I'm doing. I'm following instructions in a book. I'm following instructions that, I sort of learned a few months ago. So all of it is still feeling pretty new. And like learning to make shoes, I had to learn everything from scratch. I didn't know how to sew, didn't know how to use a sewing machine. Didn't know I've never worked with leather before, so it wasn't just learning how to make shoes, it was learning how to do everything involved with making shoes. It's been a really fun challenge, and it's been really exciting.
Well, and it sounds like, at least from my perspective, like there's some parallels between the bass playing and the shoemaking, or at least the approach and the immersion and, like figuring out all those steps.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, bass playing, I'm pretty short, right? I'm 5'3", so the bass has always been a challenge size-wise, and I have very, very little hands. So trying to figure out how to play the bass in a way that's right for me has been quite a journey. And I think, so I had a teacher most of my teachers have been they're big men. And it's only my current teacher who's helped me figure out how to play the bass that works for me. Up till sort of mid last year, I had to play with heels on. Otherwise, I couldn't, it was difficult to hold the bass. Didn't know where to put my feet. It was always I didn't feel stable. Like I was kind of perched on the stool, and he was never happy with the way I sat, and we spent months trying to figure out a better way for me to sit and better way for me to hold a bass. And turns out that it was all in my left hand technique, and he's managed to help me figure out how to play the bass so that I can now do it without heels, both feet on the floor, and it's almost like I've grown and can now play this instrument that is a little bit too big.
What did he do in terms of the approach? I mean, was it like, did you drop the end pin? Did you change the stool? Did you rotate the bass out more? What, as somebody who's like a relatively tall guy who's taught a lot of smaller students, like I would love to know what maybe specifically worked for you.
I started sitting a little bit lower.
Ah, okay.
The weird thing is, like, we didn't change all that much. I think it was mostly in the way that we started working with the left hand and gravity and the way that I would hold the neck. He started talking a lot about like Alexander technique and the way that you should be sitting and not tensing the shoulders and feeling relaxed. Yeah. Sort of in the upper half of the body. But yeah, figuring out the stool height took a really long time. It was the number of stools that I've been through is quite funny. But we ended up with a stool that he found at an op shop. I think you guys call it a thrift store. So he found a stool and got to a lesson, and he's like, look, I found you a stool, and it was still a little bit too high. So he got the saw out and started sawing the legs off in the lesson, and sort of just figured out how to get me to sit a little bit more sort of forward, but still the chair, because kind of what I was doing for a long time in trying to get my feet planted on the floor. And in terms of like where the bass sat, I think the last bass that I was playing had a flat back, and it didn't quite work with the length of my legs. So after switching to a bass that had a round back, it was able to actually rest against my leg instead of just flopping to the side and not having any support and having to have my left leg raised on like a footstool or on the side of the seat. Or it was a combination of different things of finding the right stool and then finding the right bass, and it all just kind of came together.
Mm-hmm. And so now you have both feet flat on the floor when you're playing? Is that how it's working for you when you're on that stool?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's amazing because I've never been able to do that before.
Yeah. Folks have been raving about D'Addario's Kaplan strings. I've been using them for the last year or so, and I really love them. And here's some feedback from people that recently won Kaplan strings in our D'Addario giveaway.
Hi, Jason. This is Kim Perillo calling. So over the summer, I was one of the lucky winners of a new set of Kaplan strings. And now that I've had the strings on for several months, I wanted to share some thoughts. I opted for the heavy tension set, and I feel like the phrase heavy tension might sound a little scary, but they are easy to play on while still giving you that like punchy sound when you need it. Overall, the trend for bass strings seems to be going brighter and brighter, and in that context, these strings are a little on the darker side, but they are not dull in the slightest. Still a great, crisp, clear sound. Thanks, Jason, and thank you, D'Addario.
Learn more at contrabassconversations.com/strings, and thanks to D'Addario for sponsoring the podcast. Well, folks can, I'll link up to this, but they can see all the different heel combinations you've tried on your Instagram feed. Yeah. So you can, and the whole shoemaking, and you've got these just lovely, like you behind the bass, or I'm assuming it's you, and like different hands. And there's one that has, I was still trying to figure out what the heck was going on. It was like two legs and like 5 hands. So you have such a fun and whimsical and creative, just in all these various endeavors. Like, how do you come up with these ideas that you put out on Instagram? I know that's a super broad question, but it's just I just love what you come up with. Can you share anything about the thought process or when creativity strikes you in terms of that, or?
Well, all those really cool bass photos, I cannot take any credit for.
Okay.
The one with all the hands coming out, that was actually for a campaign that Work was shooting for the Melbourne Queer Film Festival, and it was just one of the things that they were trying. I don't think they ended up using the image.
Okay.
But it was a fun shoot.
I'll bet.
It was quite funny trying to squeeze everyone behind the bass and to just not have anyone show through. There actually wasn't as much Photoshop as you would think with that particular photo.
Wow.
We're all kind of just crouched behind. The other ones of me with the bass sort of like floating and jumping. Mm-hmm. That was part of the Victorian Youth Symphony orchestra shoot that we did, where we wanted to, well, basically that whole campaign last year was to raise the profile of the orchestra and to try and do something a little bit different in the classical music space. We did a lot of work in terms of, looking at how orchestras brand and market themselves, and largely it's all much of the same.
Yeah.
And being a youth orchestra, there's an energy about what we're trying to do. We are playing old music, but the music is not the problem. I think we've identified that it's the packaging that could use some work. So all those images were just part of us trying to do something a little bit different, to breathe a bit of life into the way that classical music is usually marketed. But going back to your question on how I sort of decide what to put up on Instagram, it's usually things that I'm working on and I feel like sharing it with the world, and there's not as much thought that goes into it. It's usually just me taking a photo with my phone as I'm working through things, or actually usually as I'm working through things and wanting to share that process with everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's fun to follow along with, and it's definitely, there's like an intrigue behind your Instagram feed. So I definitely, it's one of those that I sort of like go down the rabbit hole. And going back to that campaign and those images, there's like kinetic energy or something in a lot of those photos. I love it. There seems to be motion in a lot of them, which is cool because music's about motion. And I mean, there's motion in music. And was that one of the things you were consciously thinking about, or what were some of the influences that came through in that campaign?
Well, in terms of the larger campaign or the individual portraits?
Maybe just start with the individual portraits, and then we can talk about the campaign.
So the portraits, well, we wanted to feature our musicians, and we wanted to capture images that would allow us to then tell stories about the musicians in the orchestra is where it really started. Mm-hmm. Because, it's easy for orchestral musicians to kind of blend into this larger group where they become faceless musicians. Mm-hmm. And we felt that it was important to talk about each of our musicians, because being a community orchestra, we all have stories, and it's not that all of us do this full time. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to sort of highlight what else other people are doing besides music, and how that contributes to the way they play or their lifestyle. So when we decided to do a shoot, we were very conscious of not just, doing your typical headshots where you're sitting there posing with your instrument. I was lucky enough to be working with two art directors so we did that shoot at work. They were very kind to let us use the photography studio that we've got. I was very lucky to be working with two art directors who were young and were just happy to try different things. And so they just wanted to try and create beautiful images. Yeah. The instruments that we all play are beautiful, and when you shoot them, they look really good as well. So they just wanted to experiment and see if we could do something a little bit out there. And we started getting people to jump and lie sort of backwards on tables, and so we could get, weird angles of their faces or of their hair, and then flipping the photo so that it looks like they were defying gravity, and cool stuff that, required minimal photoshopping, but just by flipping angles and rotating pictures, you could get something quite interesting and different to what you would normally see come from, an orchestra's sort of marketing campaign.
Yeah. Just in general, like, orchestra campaigns, or it's such an easy thing to be faceless in, right? Because you have this group of 70, 80, 90 people. I'm playing a concert right now, and I just am even realizing just sort of the anonymity of that. And so to highlight the musicians and give this sort of visual story behind it is so cool. And again, another broad question, but like, what else do orchestras tend to miss the boat on, in your opinion, just in terms of marketing or telling a story or getting a message out there? What have you seen that could use some improvement out there? Probably a lot, but
a lot. I think that, everyone says that, classical music is dead. Young people are not interested in it. I don't know if you've seen the work that I think it's the LA Phil. Mm-hmm. They did a whole bunch of research. I think it was a couple of years ago now, but they spoke to a whole bunch of young people and tried to find out what it is that they didn't like about classical music. And it's actually not the music itself, right? It's the packaging and the way that orchestras market themselves. In doing the research to see, so when we're looking at a campaign, we like to understand what our competitors are doing and what everyone else is doing, so that we can understand what the rules are, so we know which rules we can start to break. And in doing that, we realize that every single orchestra kind of looks the same. All of their social media profiles also look the same. So there's no distinguishing feature between orchestras across the world, apart from, oh, this orchestra is conducted by this famous person. And it's difficult to get, if you're talking about building an audience and growing an audience for this genre of music that is supposedly outdated, if you're, trying to sell this thing where there's so many rules that nobody really cares all that much about, to a bunch of people who have no interest in following those rules, it's a pretty big ask.
Yeah.
And I think that's a massive issue. No one is actually looking to create a unique identity for their orchestra. I mean, look, even if you look at the sort of the big name orchestras like the London Symphony or the Berlin Phil, like what are the distinguishing features between these orchestras from a visual perspective?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing. They all, everyone dresses the same. Everyone's in formal dress. Their visual identity, I mean, the LSO is starting to do some cool stuff, but it's still pretty traditional in terms of the way that they talk about the programming, and, the way that orchestras talk about their concerts is they focus on the composers, but those composers don't mean anything to people who aren't into classical music. So you're trying to sell something to a new audience, but you're not speaking the same language, or even speaking in a language that they understand. Mm-hmm. So I understand not alienating your core audience, but your core audience is currently aging and isn't going to be around forever.
Yeah. Well put. And there was a great part, I'm assuming it's part of this campaign or something, for the Victorian Youth Symphony that had it was like about Britain and Tchaikovsky, if I'm remembering right, and it was like talking about like the youth or of Britain, contrasting it with Tchaikovsky, and it was just an interesting, it was talking about the composers, but it was an interesting story, and a story I hadn't really thought of in relation to those two. So that to me was an example of something that I'm not used to seeing. And even the presentation of it, the YouTube video sort of trailer for it, all of those elements.
Yeah. Well, with what we were trying to do with that campaign, or just the entire 2017 season, was to see if we could bring in a little bit more, of a storytelling structure to the way that we would talk about these programs, because the music that we're playing is so powerful and it invokes such strong emotions. When you read, program notes for these symphonies, it's often pretty dry.
Yes.
And they talk about the sort of theory side of things. Oh, they use this harmonic structure, and to the average person, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't tell them anything about this piece. It doesn't help them listen to this piece in a way that would possibly change the way that they would listen to the piece. So when we were developing the campaign, it was actually nice to be working with a bunch of creators who don't, play classical music, because they were asking all of these questions, like, tell us about Tchaikovsky's life, or tell us about Britain's life, and at what point was Tchaikovsky writing this piece, and what point in Britain's life was he writing this piece, and being able to draw on those on a different perspective, I think was really helpful, and a really interesting exercise to see what we could do in terms of breaking the mold with, orchestra marketing.
Yeah, and it's something that your average orchestra musician is coming from such an academic background, typically with their bachelor's and their master's and their music theory and this and that, and it's hard for them to see it from anything but an academic perspective. So just getting somebody who isn't indoctrinated in all of that to look and ask, tell me about these people's lives. It's something that I think people who are too inside that world, they might not even think to do. So cool campaign. Yeah. I will link up to all of this, and just really inspiring work that they've done. Yeah. And I'm just, it's super cool. You've developed this super cool career for yourself. You're obviously like you're a young person, and there's a lot in store for you and changes and all sorts of things. And I'd love to have you on for a round 2 or a round 3 or a panel discussion or anything. The door is always open. I usually have some sort of advice question that I ask at the end. And this might be a weird one, but I mean, you've been playing bass 4 years now. If you could go back and talk to Melody the day she picked up that bass for the very first time, is there anything you might tell her?
I think it would be just have done what you've done. It's kind of weird because I don't think I would change anything that I've done with the bass. Mm-hmm. It's been a really sort of nice journey of discovery. Yeah. Because it was unexpected. Maybe the piece of advice would just be to just keep an open mind and just let things sort of develop as they will.
Yeah. Thank you, Melody. Great to chat with you. I'm sure we'll do a round 2 and a round 3 at some point in the future. And again, links to her website, what she's writing about, her Instagram, all that good stuff in the show notes. Be sure to follow along with her. Super cool person, really inventive and creative. And yeah, had a great time chatting. Thank you, Lauren Pierce, for the suggestion. And if you are new to the podcast, welcome. I would love it if you subscribe to the show. You can do so at contrabassconversations.com/subscribe. We've got all kinds of options, including a free app for Android, iOS, and Kindle. If you have any ideas for guests or topics or anything like that, reach out to me at feedback@contrabassconversations.com. I respond to each and every message, and I just love hearing from people. And if you've been listening for weeks, months, years, whatever, and you haven't reached out, send me a message. I'd love to hear from you. Or you can also connect on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, YouTube, wherever you hang out. I'm sure we're there. These podcasts are brought to you by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. And Mitch Mooring makes beautiful basses in the Dallas area. Look him up online at mitchmooring.com if you're looking for a bass. I am Jason Heath, your host, coming to you from beautiful San Francisco, California. California. I can't even say my own state. And we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.